Okay, this recording will cover Chapter 1 in your textbook, Monitoring and Teaching for Understanding. I'm also going to throw in some additional information that is not in the textbook. Well, it is, but I have it just from previous courses and previous semesters, and hopefully it will just be a review for you, but I want to make sure to throw some of that information out to you as well. So here are the outcomes from the chapter. There are a good number, just from one chapter, but that's okay. We'll get through it. All right, so let's talk about special ed, kind of where it started. And again, some of this stuff might be a review for some of you who have taken some other special ed courses, whether here or somewhere else. So, rights of children with disabilities, when a student differs from the norm, and that's kind of in quotes, right? That student may need the protection and guarantees of the federal law. And the way that that happens now is with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, or IDEA, whatever you want to call it. I think I usually say IDEA, so you know that when I say that, this is what I'm referring to. Okay, and then there's also something called Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and we will talk about that as well and how it differs from IDEA or IDEA. I probably just said something that I said I wasn't going to say. Anyway, so the history of education for students with disabilities. This, special ed is a relatively new field, right? It basically just started in the 1970s. So I'm sure some of you are like, "Ooh, that's so long ago. That's so old." But it's not really. It's not really that long to provide services and programs to students with disabilities. So back then, and again, not that long ago, what, 50 years ish, children either received inappropriate or inadequate services. Up to 1 million children were totally excluded from the educational system, right? So think about if that was your child or your brother or your sister or your friend, and they weren't allowed to come to school. They were told, nope, sorry, you can't come because you're different than, the quote unquote norm. So a lot of those students received their education in very segregated settings. And then some children with disabilities receive services in residential programs. And if you want to be really sad, you could look up something. It's called Willowbrook. It's all one word. And it's this expose that I think, what was his name? Geraldo Rivera, or I think that's his name, right? He went to this institution back in like the 60s and just showed how terrible the conditions were and how awful it was for those people or those residents, of that institution. So if you want to be sad, just look it up. Again, it's called Willowbrook. In my face-to-face classes, we do watch it for a few minutes, but it's pretty sad. So just so you know, some history. Back in the day, people thought, oh, it's superstition. Oh, they're witches. Oh, we're gonna drill into their head and suck out the evil spirits that's causing them to act this way, right? We all know that is not true. Then the institutions, just sending individuals with disabilities to these segregated, usually pretty terrible places. Then, public schools started, but some of our students with disabilities were still segregated. Then, era of legislation, national support. President Kennedy was really one of the ones who kind of started the conversation about special education. He had a sister, I think, who had some significant disabilities, and I think it was a sister. But that's kind of where Special Olympics started, which is actually what got me into special ed. But he's kind of the first one that ever really said, "Hey, well, what about these kids? They're still kids. And then they're still adults with disabilities. How can we support them?" So then, moved into kind of normalization, rededication, redefinition, refinement. We're still going. We're still making changes. Special ed is still evolving and improving. Hopefully, every year. So just a little more history. The first U.S. school for children with deafness was called the American Asylum for the Education of the Deaf and Dumb, which, yes, I do not love either the word asylum or dumb, but one of my former students pointed out, well, that's what they were called then, which is true. So at least we've graduated, I guess, from using that word, and hopefully none of you or none of your friends uses the R word. That is very offensive. Instead of mental retardation, we now say intellectual disabilities. We'll get into that as we go along. But hopefully, if you hear that word, it is up to you to do your part to stop it. I've gotten in very heated discussion with people my age about that word. So There's my little PSA for the day. Okay, and then the next school for children with visual impairments was the New England Asylum for the Blind. Again, that asylum. All right, so again, there have been dramatic changes since the 70s. Hooray. Still not, where the services and the field needs to be, but at least it's better than it was, right? So services are more appropriate, and many more students are now provided services in gen ed classrooms, right, with collaboration between the special ed teachers and the gen ed teachers. So, if you're in this class because you're going to be a gen ed teacher, hopefully you will learn maybe some collaboration, maybe some strategies that you can use with gen ed teachers. And if you're going to be a special ed teacher, in the reverse, you can provide some strategies and some collaboration with the gen ed teacher. Okay, so back in the days, again, 1900 to 1970 was really a phase of isolation for these students. They were, like I said, denied access, or they attended schools in very isolated settings, maybe 20 minutes down the road kind of thing, and only with other individuals with disabilities. So no real, quote unquote, typical or neurotypical peers around them. Then integration mainstreaming phase came along in the early 1970s to mid 80s. Some people still use these words, integration mainstreaming, but really we're looking more for inclusion. All right, so back in the mainstreaming phase, some students were integrated into some gen ed programs, and typically it was special areas or lunch or recess or something like that. Whereas now we're looking towards more full inclusion, where students are included in most or all school programs and activities, including after school, including academic classes, stuff like that. So just some differences between integration and inclusion. Integration assumes that students with disabilities belong in special ed and are to be placed in general ed part-time and mostly for socialization. So back in kind of this integration phase, people thought, oh, well, we can, integrate these students with disabilities, but only for socialization because they're never going to get anything out of it academically, which we know is not true, right? Individuals with disabilities are very capable and can be very successful. Okay, so now inclusion assumes that students with disabilities belong in gen ed classrooms with appropriate supports, right? We're not just going to throw these students into gen ed classrooms with teachers and say, here you go ahead and teach these children. So one of the things I really want you to remember throughout this course is that special education is a service. It's not a place, right? We're not just going to say, oh, we're going to throw that child into special education down the hall. It's not a place. It's a specialized instruction and services for students with disabilities. And that's a big change. Back in the day, again, special education was thought of as a place. And now we want to think of it as specialized instruction, services, supports for students with disabilities. So defining students with exceptionalities, wide range. I'm sure if you've been out in classrooms lately, you've seen students with disabilities, students with special gifts, right? Our students who are considered gifted or talented, and students who are at risk for developing problems. And, there's usually a pretty good mix under or in one single classroom. All right, so students served under IDEA, they have to meet specific criteria as having one or more of the disability categories. And the number of students who qualify for special ed has grown significantly since the mid-70s, which is good, again. So IDEA was initially called Public Law 94-142 or PL 94-142. And it was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. And again, I believe President Kennedy was kind of the one who started this and authorized this. So just kind of something to remember what it used to be called. Before 1975, again, there was nothing for these students with disabilities, so they would just get ignored. They would have inappropriate education, if any. So at least, 1975, people are like, hey, we need to do something for these students. So then it was reauthorized. PL 94-142 was reauthorized as IDEA in 1990. It's also been reauthorized in 1997, 2004. It was slated to be reauthorized until 2011. It was then pushed back until, and I know this is, older dates, until at least 2014. And still, to my knowledge, it is still to this day not been fully reauthorized. They've made some change, the lawmakers and the policymakers, and unfortunately, it's very political. It's very dependent on who is in office and our Secretary of Education as well. But I won't even get started on that. All right, so adversely affects. This is something that you will hear over and over. So when we start talking more about some of the disabilities, you'll see the phrase adversely affects educational performance. So this doesn't mean, the child has to be failing to receive special education and related services. IDEA says that states must make a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, we'll talk about that, available to any individual child with a disability who needs special education and related services, even if the child has not failed or been retained in a course or grade and is advancing from grade to grade. But you all know that students tend to just be passed on sometimes, right? They're just passed on and passed on and passed on. And then by the time they get to 10th grade, they're reading on a second grade level. And then the teacher says, you can't really read. Obviously not to the child, but you all have seen that. So we need to look about this phrase adversely affects educational performance. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. So some key purposes or, key components of IDEA. Again, free, appropriate public education with related services. That stands for FAPE, ensuring the rights of the children and the parents are protected. Some parents, they don't know what they're what they're allowed for their students. So we have to make sure that their rights are protected as well. And then all these, assisting states and federal agencies, early intervention, tools, and effectiveness of efforts. We want to make sure that we're doing things that are helping these students with disabilities. Okay, again, IDEA has been reauthorized several times. 1983 provided incentives for serving preschool children. 1986 mandated services for children with disabilities ages 3 to 5. And then 1990 replaced the word handicap with the word disabilities, added autism and TBI, and required transition planning. And then in, what's her name? Rosa's Law, I think, and I'm not going to say a year because I guarantee you I will get it wrong. That is, I believe it was signed by Obama, and that is where the word mental retardation was replaced with intellectual disability. And again, I'm not 100% positive of the year, and I should be. But I know it was signed into effect by Obama. It might have been 2007. I know it was President Obama, and he wanted to get rid of that word, those words, mental retardation. So then it became intellectual disability. So that's what you'll see now in IDEA. Okay, so then in 2004, there was Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. So they added that extra I. Some people call it IDEIA. I tend to still call it IDEA, and I think that's what most people call it. That's mostly what I've seen in your textbook as well. So this requires, schools to educate students with non-disabled peers when feasible. This is called the least restrictive environment, and we will get into that more. Due process rights, again, to parents and students, and then requires that special ed teachers and admin know and understand their duties and obligations under the law. And that's sometimes tricky. Sometimes the administrators at K-12 schools don't always know their obligations under the law. So we'll come back to that too. So this is now back to the textbook, the 10th edition of the textbooks, D2021. So some students, characteristics of students with learning and or behavior problems. So, kind of the learning disabilities and or some behavioral disabilities or just behavior problems. You're going to see probably a lot of these characteristics, right? You might see some poor academic performance, hyperactivity, poor language abilities, aggressive, withdrawn. You may or may not see all of these at once, but you may see more than one, if that makes sense. All right, so then, when we're looking at determining the severity of a learning or behavior problem, really, if you look at students, about 15 to 25% of them exhibit some sort of learning or behavior problem. However, only about 6% or less than 6% of all those students, of all these right here, are identified for special education. So they're the only ones that really qualify under one of those IDEA categories. 5 times more prevalent, learning disabilities and behavior disorders. And then some other things we want to think about: persistence and severity of the problem. It's not just a one-time deal, right? It happens more than once, and it happens over months, over years. We want to look at motivation, prior performance level, prior learning experiences. Did the student learn how to read when they were in kindergarten, first grade, and second grade? If they didn't, if no one taught them, then it's probably not a learning disability. It's probably just a result of poor instruction. What is their relationship to the teacher response to modifications? Is there an age behavior discrepancy between what we expect and what we're seeing? Language and cultural differences, again, not necessarily disability, and parents' response to the child's problem. All right, I'm going to stop here for part one, so come on back for part two.